All
and
right,
Bob
folks.
report.
So I think we have most people in. People have had a good amount of time to get in here. Just as a heads up to everyone who's watching, for questions and such, you can send direct messages or you can raise your hand and one of the moderators can then talk with you, share your question after we get through the presentations. But other than that, I think we're set to start. So with that, I believe it is the Kitchissippi Ward Councillor who is going first.
Thank you very much, and I'll just say welcome everybody to the budget consultation. I don't have prepared remarks, so I'll keep everything very brief. As always, I am really pleased to see the level of engagement that comes from the residents of our urban wards. We know that you folks are watching the budget carefully. We know that you have strong ideas about them, and I think Ariel, Sean, and I tend to be very aligned with the values that we hear from you time and time again. We've been through a very interesting election. I've been through 3 elections now, and what we heard was, I think, some of the clearest messaging in the budget process in Kitchissippi that I've heard through 3 campaigns now, where we heard a lot about policing, we heard a lot about transit, we heard a lot about affordable housing, and I think, even with the very high level of engagement that we have in our wards around those issues, and in my ward, transit just kept coming up along with affordable housing. All of council has also heard that as well. So the message on housing and transit particularly is widespread across the city. And I think you'll see that this council is very committed to at least trying to address those issues of transit and of housing. But whether or not we do will depend on the budgets that we pass over the course of the next 4 years. I'm not going to delve too deep. I think it's an opportunity to hear from you folks about that. But the budget, this very first budget of the term, is not necessarily making the strides that we need to make in order to try to build the city that many of you have told us that we're trying to build. We're going to hear from Isabel about some of the constraints around the budget and what doing different would mean, but be assured that Ariel, Sean, and I tend to be very aligned in terms of wanting to see something different, and I think in future budget processes for the rest of this term of council, you'll see that we want to work with you to try to achieve particularly gains on the transit and housing. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much. I think it's over to me now. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Ariel Troster. I am the new city councillor for Somerset Ward in downtown Ottawa. So I'm just here to say, we all know that what we spend on a city tells us who we are. And as you will hear from city staff and from the other councillors here, the city budget was crafted with a very specific goal in mind. It was to reduce spending in an effort to keep property taxes as low as possible. Mayor Sutcliffe also promised to not reduce frontline services to residents, but what many of us are seeing is that a hold steady budget in the face of massive inflation is actually a fairly large cut. We're all feeling it. Our dollars are stretching much less than they used to. The cost of everything from food to construction materials to gas has gone up considerably. And so what I've always maintained, and also what I heard from residents during the campaign, is that in a time of need, our residents need city services more rather than less. So this is why I voted against the initial political direction for the budget, because I believe it shortchanges the city and it prevents us from making progress on very real challenges, including the housing and homelessness emergency and the overdose and mental health crises. So today I was in the meeting of the Planning and Housing Committee with Chair Leifer, where we voted on our yearly financial allocation for building new affordable housing. The figure in the 2023 budget is $15 million. That's unchanged since 2019. Meanwhile, the estimated cost of construction inflation alone is roughly 6%. And as our wonderful friends from the Mission told us at committee today, the same amount of money in the face of this kind of inflation is a cut. So it's been 3 years since Ottawa declared a housing and homelessness emergency. And since then, the number of people sleeping outside has doubled. Over 12,000 people remain on the waiting list for subsidized housing. Between 2019 and 2020, 8,619 people were homeless, 46% of them for the first time. Something else that we're seeing is the loss of funding that was provided by the federal government and the province during the pandemic. So the funding was supposed to be temporary. It was used in a wide variety of programming across Ottawa, including food pantries, peer-to-peer street outreach, emergency needs. But if the funding needs for these programs can't be met because that provincial and federal funding was temporary, sorry, that's my cat. We'll see a drastic increase in demand for services that are already underfunded and overloaded, and that's going to leave people's basic human needs unmet. The average resident doesn't really know or care what level of government funding comes from. They just want their basic needs met: food, shelter, community support. So if we're not able to backfill programs like Cooking for a Cause, which ran out of the Parkdale Food Center and provided thousands of hot meals a week till the end of 2022, people are just going to go without, and going without food is not a choice that anyone should have to make. These choices are particularly stark when we see the areas where we are increasing funding: policing and roads. The city budget contains $21 million to expand the airport parkway, which is the exact same path where we are in the midst of building an LRT extension. It also increases the Ottawa police budget to nearly $400 million. Over the last 20 years, the OPS budget has more than tripled, outpacing both inflation and population growth. This is coming at a time where more and more of us are looking at alternatives to policing, particularly when it comes to mediating conflicts that have to do with poverty, homelessness, addiction, and mental health. Early research shows that non-police crisis intervention programs reduce the cost of policing, in addition to reducing the costs associated with emergency room visits and short-term incarceration. And above this, residents in areas with non-police response teams, they report better access to services and an increased feeling of safety. In the city of Denver, Colorado, a program of this nature helped reduce the rate of minor crime by 34% in the city. So despite some verbal support from other councillors about the importance of investing in a new model of this nature, this budget does not make any more doesn't move any more resources into the community for this purpose. You know, what we're really talking about, some people might use the term defund the police, is appropriately funding frontline community services. Here's what we know for sure: we can't police ourselves out of the overdose crisis. From 2019 to 21, we saw a 100% increase in opioid overdose deaths in Ottawa. From 2019 to 2021, we saw a 110% increase in opioid overdose emergency department visits in Ottawa. But I don't want to end my talk with only doom and gloom, even though I am gravely worried about my neighbors in Somerset Ward and around the city in the face of what I would absolutely call an austerity budget. I get a lot of hope from gatherings like this, people like you. I do genuinely believe that all of my colleagues on City Council care about the people in the city. We just need to keep working together to put the focus on how city budgets impact the daily lives of our neighbors who are struggling. And I really believe we can end chronic homelessness in our city if we work together. I don't think this budget does it, but I think we do have a longer ramp over the next 4 years. And also, this is a much shortened consultation process because there is an election. I really think as soon as this budget process is over, we start building for the next one and the one after that. So thank you very much, and I apologize for the meowing cat. It's all part of the Zoom charm.
Okay, I think I'm up next, and just wanted to welcome everybody, and so pleased to be here with Councillor Leeper and Councillor Troster. And I just want to thank our staff first and foremost for organizing this. Our teams have put this together, and Tessa's moderating for us tonight. But I just want a huge thank you to our teams who helped to put this together, and folks that are attending tonight. One of the things I wanted to mention is just the changing budget process. It looks like we're going to have changes in the future to the budget and how we're consulting on it. So one of the things that people might want to raise tonight is ideas about how we do that, because in the past, we've had the budget come out and we haven't seen a ton of changes after the budget's been released. And so how can community members have more of an influence over their budget earlier on in the process? So I know that's something that we discussed in the governance review, and people may have ideas about participatory budgeting or other budgeting processes in terms of consultation early that they may want to raise tonight, and that would be a good forum to do that as well. Obviously, during budget directions, several councils were concerned about the across the board 2.5% tax increase with inflation well above 6% in recent months, and with revenue shortfalls expected from recent legislation imposed by the province. And so without sufficient flexibility, kind of see differential rates for certain envelopes within the global percentage. It's really a barrier to reallocating funds away from what we might consider wasteful spending to where they're disproportionately needed. And so, thankfully, in that governance process, we were able to find unanimous support for a motion at City Hall to ensure that moving forward, budget directions will consider targeted budget increases based on council priorities, as opposed to the across-the-board approach that we saw this year for our boards in particular. And so people obviously are concerned about the 15 million for housing too. That's the 5th year in a row we've got that amount, and Councillor Troster mentioned it. I think if you compare that to other capital budgets on things like roads, it's very, very small and doesn't account for inflation and needs to be increased. It's also worth noting here a recent and I think positive step towards addressing some wasteful spending. Council did pass a motion from myself and Mayor Sutcliffe instructing city staff to review the city's subsidy program for developers and community improvement plans, which is where that Porsche dealership tax break came from. So I think the issue has been a point of agreement and collaboration amongst a number of councillors, and certainly between myself and the mayor. As you may have heard from, my campaign during the recent election, our city should not be spending more on subsidies for for-profit developers than it does on building actual affordable housing. So, we need a city budget that puts people first, and definitely pushing for that around the council table. I'm happy to have staff here. Isabel Jasmine does an amazing job and had presented at our South End budget discussion as well. So really pleased to have that team with us, and special guests too that I know will be presenting later. So looking forward to working with all of you. And I think, Tessa, I'm handing it back to you.
Yes, thank you. So now I will pass it off to Isabel, who's going to give a presentation from the city, talking a bit about the budget, specific parts of the budget, and more of a top view of where we're putting money this year and what we're going to be doing with it.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I'll wait for the slides to come up. Okay, so good evening. My name is Isabel Jasmine, and I'm the Deputy City Treasurer, Corporate Finance. Today, I'm here representing the City of Ottawa Finance Services Department to provide an overview of the budget process. There's an next slide. So there's an overarching framework for determining how much needs to be collected from taxes to pay for city services. To ensure that the budget remains affordable, the best place to start is with a tax target. The city estimates and determines any increases to expenditures resulting from inflation, increases from collective agreements, changes in regulation, legislation, growth to service new neighborhoods, and changes in funding from other levels of government. These are then offset by savings from efficiencies that can be achieved from operations, increases in revenues from fees that are charged directly to users of city services, and taxes for new assessment that particularly help to pay for increased operating and infrastructure costs to service new neighborhoods. Next slide. So in 2023, the total draft operating budget for the city is $4.5 billion. Much of the operating budget, nearly 60%, is made up of 4 key services, which are water and sewer, police services, transit, and community and social services. As you will see on the next slide, much of the cost of these services come from sources other than tax. For example, water and sewer is paid for by revenue from water bills. Less than half of transit operating costs are paid for by fare revenue. And over 80% of community and social services are paid for by provincial and federal funding. Next slide. Here you can see that 50% of revenue comes from taxes and payment in lieu of taxes. 23% comes from federal and provincial grants, and 22% comes from fees and charges. For example, the water bill, transit fares, parks and recreational fees, etc. Next slide. For 2023, the draft capital budget is $1.06 billion. The high asset intensive areas are primarily for water and sewer services, transit and transportation, which includes roads. The bulk of the capital budget for tax-supported services is for the renewal and replacement of aging infrastructure. The remainder is for growth, which is new infrastructure, which is primarily funded by development charges. Next slide. As you can see in this graph, 62.5% of capital funding comes from cash reserves, which are put aside as a capital contribution from the operating budget every year. The remainder of the capital program is funded by debt, funding from other levels of government, and development charges. Next slide. This slide highlights the fact that there is very little discretion to reduce spending for many of the city's services. The police budget is tabled separately, and council does not have discretion to make line item changes. They can only approve or reject the budget in its entirety. Budget reductions in other areas like transit, fire, paramedics, and roads must be accompanied by changes in service standards. There's also a long list of services or expenditures where there is no discretion because these services are mandated, regulated, or mandatory, such as long-term care, public health, housing, and our debt charges. There's a little more discretion in areas funded by fees, where the fees can be increased to recover the cost of delivering the service, or in areas where there are no specific service standards or for administrative support services. Next slide. Council approved the budget directions for 2023, which are summarized here. Municipal tax target was set at 2.5% overall, including citywide levy, Ottawa Police Services levy, and the transit levy, all at 2.5%. The annual additional taxation revenues from growth was forecasted at 2.2%, which is over and above the 2.5. Rate programs increase revenue by 4.2% overall, as per the long-range financial plan for water, wastewater, and stormwater. And user fees and charges increase in accordance with the fiscal framework or long-range financial plan. The capital budget is developed in accordance with the direction outlined in the DC background study, long-range financial plan, and our fiscal framework. Next slide. So this slide highlights the steps and timelines for the 2023 budget process. Because of the 2022 election, the timeline differs from the typical process you would see in other years. The budget directions report was approved on December 7th, 2022. In February, all budgets were tabled on February 1st, 2023. And in February 2023, individual budgets for each committee, board, and commission is reviewed. It's at these meetings that the public has the opportunity to provide feedback and input on the budget via public delegations. Individual committees have the flexibility to make recommendations to make budget changes. It could be funded from reductions in other committee budgets. The budget will be approved as a whole on March 1st, 2023. Next slide. This is a list of the budget meetings at which public delegations can provide input and recommendations. The list can be found on the city's website and is updated if there are any changes made to the dates. Next slide. So there are several resources available to you and ways that you can provide input to the budget throughout the year. Engage Ottawa provides a comprehensive online engagement platform that allows you to connect with the city in an interactive manner. To provide input, you can complete the online survey or contact your counselor. You can also get additional information on the city's website at ottawa.ca/budget. All feedback is reviewed and considered. Your participation in this public meeting today is greatly appreciated, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have on this presentation. Thank you.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you, Isabella. Are you all set there?
Yep.
Perfect. Awesome. So we'll head on over to Inez from Vivek Research, and they'll give a little presentation, and then we'll have a presentation from one of the members of the Coalition for People's Budget, and then we'll have about 40 minutes to an hour for questions after. So Inez, if you want to get set up, and then Stephanie can get the slides going.
Sure. I'm ready to start whenever the slides are up. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Inez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an economist and co-founder of Vivek Research. And today I'm going to be going over for the next 15 minutes, just a quick bit of information about accessibility and transparency and the framing of the city budget. Next slide, please. So just for a little bit of context, Vivek Research is an Ottawa-based economic consulting firm, and we've been operating since September of 2020, and a lot of our work has focused on municipal funding and municipal services available here in Ottawa. So I'm very happy to be part of this conversation, and the city budget process is something that I think is super important and love to see this kind of community engagement around that. Next slide. Okay, so I guess for a bit of context, we might gloss over some of these slides quickly because it follows a lot from what was just presented by city staff. So, but the main focus of what I wanted to go over was the accessibility and transparency of the city's budget, because as it stands right now, for most of the standing committees, detailed line-by-line budget documents aren't shared with the public. And that lack of transparency makes it difficult for residents to be fully engaged in the budget process. And the goal here today is to give residents the tools to interpret the city's budget documents, to be able to distinguish between the narratives being shared and to be able to fully engage in budget consultation sessions by using the documents made available to them. So as it stands right now on the city's website, if you go to the city 2023 budget information page and you click on the first hyperlink of this report, brings you to the city council's agenda. And there you'll see, I think it's 42 different documents that go over summaries of the operating and capital budgets and the different summary budgets for all of the standing committees. So it's a lot of information and it can be difficult to digest. So the goal today is to just present a little bit more information so that people feel more comfortable really diving into the materials that are shared. Next slide, please. So this will sound familiar because it was just presented, but the overall city budget is made up of two components, so the operating and capital budget. The operating budget is for day-to-day delivery of programs and services, and this year it amounts to $4.5 billion. And the second component is the capital budget, which is to maintain, improve, and fund new infrastructure, and this year amounts to $1.06 billion. And this distinction is important because capital spending tends to happen over a series of years, right? So you would think of $500 million investment over 10 years. And so it might look like small investments in the capital budget in any given year, but it culminates into big projects that can then either increase the operating budget costs. So thinking of opening a new facility would then, once that facility is complete, lead to an increase in staffing costs that you'd see in the operating budget. The same way, investments in technology might lead to efficiencies and could potentially reduce costs in future years. So it's not so much the concern around will this increase spending, but it does show where the city is going and what they're investing in years to come and how's that going to matter in future years. Next slide, please. So these are the same graphics that were just presented. So I'm going to pass through them pretty quick, but the idea here is the operating budget, which is the day-to-day spending, has to be a balanced budget. So what you'll see is that revenue and expending are both equal at $4.5 billion. And while graphics like these are super important in terms of getting a broad overview of where the city is spending money, what's important is that not all of these categories represent the same amount of services, right? So on the left-hand side, we see the Ottawa Police Service, Ottawa Public Library, Public Health, with almost $400 million, $60 million, and then $130 roughly million. And while you could compare between those services, it's not entirely comparable to suggest that, we're spending 1.4% on the public library, 21% on community services, because that encompasses so many different services. So in terms of looking at these documents, they present a very clear and very helpful broad overview, but in making parallels between like how much more you spend in one area or how much less can be tricky when we don't have, you know, spending by committee in these types of documents. Next slide, please. So this also was just presented, so I don't think we need to dive into it as much, but just to say here, capital budget does not need to be a balanced budget in the same way as the operating budget. So you do have debt in the revenue side of this, but that is traditional feature of all city municipal budgets. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of the main area of focus of the presentation, and it's really diving into how to read the budget document, just to make sure that when people are navigating this document, they're not overwhelmed, and are able to draw on these resources when presenting in committees. So this is a screenshot from the draft budget operating summaries, and most of the important information is highlighted in blue already. So what you're seeing there is 2023, and then that blue column net is the money that's being spent by the city on these different areas. And that's important because you have three columns: expenses, revenue, and net. Expenses is the total amount of money made available to that service. Revenue is all of the money coming from somewhere outside of the city. That could be the federal or provincial government, can be fines, fees, grants, a variety of other sources depending on the service. And the change from the budget, so between 2022 and 2023, is the change in federal spending, not necessarily change in the entire budget, because areas like government spending from other levels of government can change from year to year, and you won't see that in that final column. Drawing your attention to just a few services to see the distinction between like how much of the budget comes from the city versus how much of it comes from other levels is mostly a reflection of whether or not these are areas that are funded primarily at higher levels of government. So somewhere like at the bottom in the last kind of section of this table, you'll see Ottawa Public Health with a total budget, so expenses at 127 million, but net, so city spending at 27 million, with province making up a big part of that distinction. For other services, that's not at all the case, like right below the library, where most of the money is coming from the city. Next slide. So then looking a little bit closer, so the second kind of document you'll see are the documents for specific committees, where there you get a breakdown of expenditures and revenues by type. And you see similar numbers to the previous slide, but with slightly different language. So it was called in like here where you see net expenditure, so right under the first red arrow, that was that first column that we were seeing on the previous slide. And then the net requirement was referred to previously as just net. So that's the money coming from the city. So slightly different language in the summary documents and in the more specific ones, but the numbers that are going to be shown are the same. And it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of numbers circulating on any given subject at one time, right? So we have like gross expenditure, which is the total budget before recoveries and allocations. You have net expenditure, which is the amount of money that that service is going to spend or projected to spend in that year. Then you have total revenue, which is money coming from outside the city, and then net requirement money coming from the city. So in conversations around increases and decreases, it's important to keep in mind which number is actually being discussed. Next slide, please. So in terms of conversations, this follows from what I just said, but conversations around increases or decreases is going to depend which metric is being used. It's important to consider if the metric being used is the appropriate one. So this is a comparison of the operating budget in 2015 and this year, 2023. And what you can see is that the share of the budget in some areas has increased or it has decreased. And that is often something that comes up in conversation, especially in conversations around large budget items, so community and social services, Ottawa Police, these are important areas where share of the budget takes up a bulk of the conversation. And while there are two things to keep in mind. One is that for slices or shares of the budget that represent a combination of services like community and social services, the share of the budget changes from year to year, but is also a reflection of what's included in the graph. So it can be hard to comment on whether, between one year to the next, there's been a huge investment in those services, or is that representing just more services in this diagram. The other thing to keep in mind is that the size of the budget changes, right? So if we were to think of it as pieces of pie, the idea would be that in 1 year you have pie, you're sharing it with 4 people, you have a quarter of the budget. The following year, you might be 5 people, and now you only have a fifth of the budget. Your share of the piece of pie would have decreased, but if you're eating from a much bigger pie, you could still have more on your plate. And so in those cases, talking about the total amount of budget or the increase from year to year might be a better metric to use. And it really depends on the context and conversation, but just keeping in mind that those are different ways of measuring changes over time. Next slide. I just wanted to check in. I think I've been talking for 15 minutes, so I wasn't sure how much time I had left.
You're all good on time. Keep going. Go ahead.
Okay. Perfect. So the last thing that I wanted to bring up was just considerations for the budget. So as someone who, doesn't work for the city, I'm also looking through budget documents that are made available. And part of what we want to do here today, and hopefully can use time in the question and answer period, is to really dive into some of the questions and the intentions behind the city budget. So we're presented with the information of where money is being spent. And while in a lot of ways there are constraints to the capacity of the city to change things from year to year, I think it's important as a community to have conversations about what is driving the current way money is being spent and what is driving the calls for change. So areas like user fees that make up a fairly important part of city revenue, it's important to consider what is being gained, what is being lost, right? In what areas do we not charge user fees? And what areas do we sometimes charge user fees, and how has this changed over the last few years? So if we take, for example, the public library, where user fees for late returns have been removed, that's somewhere where that conversation can maybe be expanded in other areas. Also in spaces where something like driving, there's user fees for transit, but not necessarily user fees for driving. And that conversation is an important one to have. And in spaces like this and Q&A sessions, I think it's important to consider why we ask certain questions and not others. This is something that was brought up by the city councilors that spoke earlier, but in terms of investments in community safety, well-being, and social investments, generally that reflect the goals set by the community well-being and safety plan, it's important to consider that at the period where we're seeing an increase in poverty from the end of the pandemic benefits and inflation driving up the cost of living. It's important to consider, does the spending reflect the scale of residents' needs? Transportation is another area that councilors touched on today, but it's important to consider where sorry, I lost my train of thought, but considering where are the needs that people are expressing being represented in the budget. So if we take, for example, spending on transportation and combine it with concerns that are being brought to, for example, the police service board and police surveys, where we hear so much about concerns about speeding and aggressive driving. For example, the residents surveys done by OPS last year that are available on their website show that speeding and aggressive driving is a priority in every single ward in Ottawa. If we look to evidence-based decision-making and see how that's reflected in the city budget, we know that road safety programs are a huge part of ensuring a reduction in speeding and aggressive driving. So it's looking at the city budget as a whole and not in siloed different spending categories, and making sure that calls by community members are being accurately reflected in every area of the city budget and not necessarily just where those conversations are being had. In terms of environment and climate change, of course, there's this progress. We see a $5 million investment in climate change master plan, which, given the state of the environment at this time, I personally am very happy to see this investment. But I think an important conversation to have as a community is how can we celebrate the progress that we've made, because we know that these changes come from community involvement. They come from grassroots advocacy while still asking for more. Sorry, can you, next slide, please. Just building off that, I think transit follows from what I was saying about the environment. We're seeing a freeze in transit fares. We know this is also due to local activism. We know it's a response to affordability crisis that community members have brought up time and time again. And I think this is another area where it's important to celebrate the wins of the movement and also recognize that there are other asks that are still on the table that we would like to see happen and are possible to happen in the coming years. Just to continue off transit instead of jumping all over my slide, we see the efficiencies that are being found in transit, so cuts to that budget effectively, and the potential for that, for delayed capital spending to have impacts in future years. Thinking about having line by line budget items for committees like transit would be super important. So to think, how can we ask for more transparency with the goal of then deepening and furthering the conversation around transit needs in the city? And lastly, two areas to touch on. So housing and homelessness. While there's a lot to discuss on this and there's a lot to bring up in terms of like, is this enough? What are we doing to ensure changes over time? I think there are 2 points that are really important here. One of them isn't, I don't have it listed on my slide, but what we're seeing is this $15 million investment to build affordable housing in the capital budget. And this is same investments that's happened year over year. So in some areas of the budget, we really see a clear reflection of inflation being central to the conversation and being used to increase budget spending. But an area like affordable housing, where inflation is equally prominent, so an increase in the cost of building materials, labor, and so on, we don't see that increase in spending, which effectively translates into a cut. Second thing is talking about language. So affordable housing, while there are definitions, they vary depending on the context. So making sure that budget documents are accessible to the reader would mean including key definitions within those documents. And lastly, looking to the police budget and the additional increase that they're calling for, $15.2 million this year, in addition to $60 million in the capital budget, including spending on a South facility. I think it's important to ask questions about what needs are these investments making, and similar to spending on transportation, asking, are these investments aligned with evidence-based research on whether or not the solutions presented are going to meet the needs of the community. Next slide. All right, so yeah, this is the last slide for me, but essentially the takeaways that I wanted to share with everyone today was that in conversations in the past and other community consultations, community members have very clearly expressed their needs and identified areas where they feel they need more support from the city. And I think the city's budget is really unique because it's a reflection of the city's priorities. And in that way, it's a reflection of how well they listen to community members who are setting the priorities by speaking up and sharing their concerns. And so to me, a key takeaway is just that transparency around the city budget is so crucial to fostering active engagement on municipal issues and making sure that everybody is comfortable and is able to have their voice heard. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Inez. And now we will pass it over to Clute, who will be speaking a bit on the perspective from the Coalition for a People's Budget. So Stephanie, if you want to throw the slides up, include if you'd like to give your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tess. All right, so just to kind of start us off, a little brief introduction to what the Ottawa Coalition for a People's Budget is. And if I can just prompt to move to the next slide. The Ottawa Coalition for a People's Budget is a group of folks that came together in 2020 amidst of the pandemic, realizing that we need participatory exercise around the city budget process that opens questions around what is possible with a tool like city budget and how can people more meaningfully participate in the process. Alternative budgeting is really popular with the federal budget, where we see alternative budgets kind of thinking about and costing out needs across the country and what it is. And we did exactly the same at a much more local level, thinking about what are real needs at the local level in Ottawa, and where and how can we cost them, and where and how can we aspirationally find money that can go into these needs. And the groups that we are working together with currently are Horizon Ottawa, Climate Justice Ottawa, Transit Riders Ottawa, Free Transit Ottawa, and we've worked with these groups in the past just to envision what aspirational budgeting could look like in the context of City of Ottawa. Next slide, please. So just kind of how what I was saying earlier, the want to do something like alternative budgeting came from this very basic question of why is it important to engage with city budgets? And as Ines has already spoken to it in great detail, city budgets dictate across all major social, economic, cultural, and infrastructural aspects how the city is going to spend money. And budgets are a really valuable opportunity for residents, as we see tonight through all of you that are in attendance, to provide input into what they want the city to be doing and what they want to see the money that the city has to be invested in. And one of the things that we found was that the current processes that are surrounding the city budgeting processes, a city budgeting process, are systematically undermining a more democratic participation of residents. We see that by the time that budgets are tabled to the time that input opportunities and windows are open, all of that is really crunched. And what we wanted to see is a more open way of engaging with people over a longer period of time, really contemplating on what our areas of key importance are for people and how they would like to see money spent in it in aspirational ways. Also, another thing we wanted to do is help people use the alternative budget as a tool to engage with the real budget, to actually ask questions about where and how can money be spent and where do we see the most needs for money to be spent in. So the coalition, since its inception, has been calling for the city to open a more participatory process around budgeting. And while consultations like this are great step, and I think engagements in this consultation, the number of engagements that we see in consultations like this are a sign that people want to know more about how they can get engaged with the city budgeting processes. Next slide, please. So again, just very briefly, like one of the things that we really hope our work through the All Budget Coalition does is highlight the power that the city has within its own jurisdiction to create deep and substantial investments, and not necessarily always be talking about responsibilities that other jurisdictions had, realizing that municipalities are limited in what they're able to do. We specifically have a real big focus around housing, climate, transit, and community services, and also around money that is currently allocated to policing and how in many ways that takes away from transformational change that we could be seeing in our community. Next slide, please. Awesome. So the last time we did, we haven't done an alternative budget this year, but the last time we did an alternative budget was around alternative budget 2022. And in that we had proposed certain mechanisms of revenue raising, some that are currently possible within the city's jurisdiction and some that the city would have to advocate to the province for. Again, keeping in mind that this is a way that people came together to aspirationally think about where and how the city could be raising money. And some of the highlights here were looking at things like parking fee increases, looking at elimination of developer subsidies, something that Shaminar just recently talked about earlier in this call, but also looking at increasing development charges, having stronger vacant unit taxes, and having a non-resident speculation tax. So, and there's actually a current StatsCan report that just came out today that talked about the housing that is used as investor properties across Canada. It's something really interesting, but kind of touches upon the same idea. Is there housing that's being held for speculation within the cities? And is there a way that we could be looking at generating revenues from something like that? Next slide, please. And then the other thing that we really looked at was looking at how can we look at diverting or reallocating funds that currently are allocated to police. And we looked specifically at diverting provincial and federal funding police and fines and fees. We looked at diverting, reducing non-frontline, non-criminal investigative services, and then defunding and detasking frontline policing. Again, I do want to say, I think this conversation makes a lot of people nervous, and validly so. But really, when communities come together, one of the approaches we're taking is to think about what are areas that we could be investing in that could lead to transformational change in society, and how not to use surveillance and law enforcement to address issues that are at core being caused by lack of affordable housing, lack of proper investment in community, lack of proper harm reduction care, all of that. So that's the perspective that the all budget takes, and that's where we look at things like, and that's the perspective through which we look at things like defunding the police or reallocating funds. Next slide, please. The other thing that we looked at, which is also really interested in, is costing out what free transit could look like. And again, this is just to think about how a service like transit, which really meets people's most basic mobility needs, can be offered for free to everybody in Ottawa that wants to take transit. Other than that, we looked at increasing weekend buses, neighborhood buses, and paratransport vehicles, and also looking at dedicated bus lanes. Next slide, please. So as I was talking earlier, one of the revenue channels we have explored within the alternative budget is looking at vacant unit tax. And the on the flip side of that is where and how have we costed the amounts that are currently needed in housing. So we looked at initiatives like the Tenant Defense Fund. We looked at a rent bank for Ottawa that allows people to apply for grants and interest-free loans that they can use to address crisis moments when they might be facing evictions, or they might be facing a risk to homelessness. We also looked at Housing First to eliminate chronic homelessness in Ottawa, costed it around $30 million, which again, I think when you put at it against the real increase that the police budget is seeing today, we can just see what some of those numbers are and how they compare. We looked at creating land transfer towards a community land trust, and we also looked at creating additional units of housing and supportive units of supportive housing and affordable housing in Ottawa. Just a comment around how every year the $15 million that's allocated to something like housing is not going as far as it could be because of all the cost of increase in developing and building housing, and how much there is a need for seeing some really substantial and transformative investments in housing development. Next slide, please. The other, oh, this is the same one. And the next slide, please. Awesome. In terms of the climate action, we had suggested revenue from divesting from the endowment fund, which funds which invests in fossil fuel and stock markets, and reinvesting that in a green climate plan that looks at creating an Ottawa Climate Finance and Economic Development Corporation, that looks at investment in energy evolution projects, and that looks at investments, really deep, substantial investments in walking and cycling infrastructure to stir away from dependence on single-use vehicles. Single person use vehicles. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. Awesome. The other really substantial area that we looked at was investments in community services, and looking at things like direct transfer for food, considering food insecurity in Ottawa is at all-time high, and it was particularly exacerbated during the pandemic. We also looked at harm reduction programs. A lot of the times, currently, what we hear from the community services sector is harm reduction is one of the greatest need. There is an opioid crisis in Ottawa. There is questions of life and death, and there just isn't enough money to go around. Something like harm reduction and investment in harm reduction can ensure that people are getting the help they need when they need it. We also looked at investments in respite spaces, mental health counseling, and public space support workers and community workers that can address highly vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. Awesome. So given all of that, the point of this exercise and this overview is just to encourage people to continue engaging with the budget, to ask the difficult questions, to engage with different committees, and ensure that we are continuing to engage with this process and asking for investments that we do need to see in our community. So this is just a list of committees that are still to come up. And I just hope that the work that we're doing is encouraging people to look at city budgets and engage with them as a tool to demand change within their communities. And then that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clude. So those were 3 awesome presentations. So now we're going to do about 40 minutes to an hour of Q&As for both the counselors and the presenters. If you'd like to submit a question, you can pop one in the little Q&A spot on the bottom toolbar. I have been compiling them for the last hour. So I will start with some questions for the counselors. So Councillor Troster, Leeper, Menard, you're free to jump in here wherever you may feel fit. And I think the first big one is going to be, what changes would you like to see made to the budget consultation process next year?
Can I start? Just because I don't have any specific changes that I'm looking for, because I think I want to understand more about what specific information people need in order to be able to provide better or more appropriate input into how we set the budget. So we need to start early next year and ask people about how they engage with the budget and where they find it lacking. There's a lot of different things that we could do. And the budget is tens of thousands of line items, most of which we don't see. You know, I don't see, for example, how much we're spending, and I know it's a little out of the tenor of this discussion this evening, but something as simple as how much are we spending to remove snow and clear snow from our streets for the safety of pedestrians and cyclists and of vehicles. You can't find that information in the budget, and I don't want to see a budget book that is 6 times thicker than the one we have currently. So there's going to be some summaries that need to be created. What are those most useful summaries in the view of residents? I think before I can come out and say, here's how I would change it, I do want to understand better what would be most helpful to the residents.
I'll just say this is my first budget season and it's a compressed one, and there's some things that I'm really surprised by. So today, for example, sitting at the Planning and Housing Committee meeting, when the framework for the budget was set out and the budget direction vote in December, the reality is that when we're looking at these individual budgets, a committee, if we say, hey, there's not enough money in there for capital funding for affordable housing, if we want to raise that budget, we have to cut it somewhere else, because we're not doing objective-based budgeting. We're doing a political budgeting exercise, because staff were told maximum tax increase of 2.5%. Here's the upper fiscal number, make it work. Instead of saying, what are our objectives? What's important to us as a city? And to start from there. You know, the reality is when staff hands council the budget, it's pretty much, it's all cooked. Like it's written. And so we're encouraging citizens to come and speak, but the reality of that having any concrete impact on the budget is very, very low. You know, for example, the community services budget meeting is on February 28th, which is literally the day before full council votes on the budget. So I'm just going to flag that I'm very puzzled by this. It's extremely problematic. And I think we need to start the consultation process much earlier. And I think we need to bring it to committee much earlier so that we have the opportunity, if we really need to advocate for change, that it doesn't have to be a horse trading game, that there's a way to have some flexibility for each committee to really take public feedback seriously and incorporate that into our budgeting.
Awesome. Would anyone else like to speak to that? No? Okay, we're good. Awesome.
I have questions to get through tonight, so I don't think we all need to speak on everyone. Councillor Leeper and Troster did a great job.
Perfect. I do have one that I think will be great for you actually next. And it's, to the counselors, to Isabel, Inez, Clue, kind of everyone, do you feel like we're taking a look at the budget with a climate lens? And do you feel like we're making enough of an impact on the climate and the way that we're budgeting and how we're taking that into account?
Yeah, so the climate lens was added to the capital side of the budget this year for the first time. It was a very brief look, but still added some context to some of those items, which was good to see. And obviously, you know, the $5 million as base budget funding is new and wasn't there in the past. So that's a start. It's not enough. You know, obviously other budgets have an effect on climate, like our transit and the move towards electric buses, or our tree planting, or other programs that may contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and our targets for 2050 and 2040 within internally in the city. That being said, you know, we previously relied on the Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus, which was not consistent year over year for climate funding. We have a staff team that's excellent, and I think have expanded in recent years. Still some positions that aren't necessarily, you know, full-time permanent, but still have expanded. So we're making progress on that front, but there's a lot to do, particularly around our buildings and our transportation systems, which are our top emitters. And those are the areas that we really need to start to see change in the city around new developments and the high performance development standard. Sorry if I'm lagging. And our transportation and of course the retrofit of older buildings. So how are we going to get residents to retrofit their buildings? We've got some programs now that allow for zero interest loans to do that on homes that have decided to retrofit. But there's a lot more that needs to be done there with partnership with other orders of government, and of course the transportation system. So, you know, moving away from so much sprawl and towards more compact communities, as well as the addition of simple things like bike lanes, walking, transit accessibility. You look at the changes we did on the Bank Street Bridge. I think it cost me a few $100s for those pylons, and for 3 years we had instant lanes created that became permanent over time because people saw the value in it and no effect to congestion in any way. So you know, there's a lot more to do on that, but this is a good start for the climate budget for this term of council, and you know, I plan to build on what's been allocated for this year.
The only thing that I'll say is that I agree with Councillor Menard, but the problem, of course, is the climate budget sits in a certain budget, but it doesn't. I'm really interested in how we can get it to impact all the other decisions we make at other committees. So people keep mentioning this widening of the airport parkway, which I don't think meets with their climate goals at all. I am a member of Transportation Committee. It will be coming to committee next week, but I'm really interested in how can we incorporate that climate lens into all of our decision making, not just items that fall specifically under climate. Because we can retrofit all the buildings we want, but expanding a highway, expanding a road is going to have huge detrimental impact from a climate perspective. So I don't have the answers to that right away, but really thinking about, and also when it comes to equity concerns, like how do we mainstream equity and anti-racism into our policy, but not just into a little budget that sits over here for equity, but into an equitable lens on how we make city policy.
Can I just say I enjoyed working with the capital budget this year. The portions that I've gone through, anyways, it's obviously hundreds and hundreds of pages of capital projects. But the capital budget is one of the most transparent parts of the budget. You can very easily track a capital project by its number. You can see how it's funded. And this year, what we've seen is that they've put in a brief, absolutely very brief assessment of what its climate impact would be. So does it have a high contribution to greenhouse gases, a medium contribution, or a low contribution? Does it improve our greenhouse gases? I would love in future budgets that language is very standard, and to get a pie chart. So in the capital budget, how many of what percentage of spending is on things that will improve our contribution to greenhouse gases, make a moderate impact to the increase in those, or a high impact to the increase of those. One of the other pieces, though, the operational budget is the one with which I always struggle, and is just not very transparent with respect to how we actually spend our money, except in those very broad categories of activities. A lot of those decisions are also they are the result of city council policies, and when the reports come forward to enact those policies, when council has a decision before it as to what policies to enact, there is a section of that report that is it speaks to the climate change implications of the report, and that's not always it's not always absolutely pertinent, but I believe that most of the decisions that the city makes do have climate change implications, even in areas where we may not necessarily think that they do. The decision to purchase electric buses is climate change. The decision to put money into retrofitting buildings, absolutely, I understand the climate change implications. When we do something like approve a development in zoning, or we zone something, that has implications for climate change. And there is a section of the report that speaks to the implications. I would love to see that language kind of standardized as well, so that at least at the end of the year, there might be a relatively easy way for city staff to collate all of the decisions, the reports that have been dealt with by council that have climate change implications, bullet those out, and if there is a financial implication, which is another piece of each report that comes before city council, that they could collect those numbers. Again, I think somebody in the Q&A spoke to tagging the reports, tagging the things, and I think that that helps to create some of those tables and summaries that would be very helpful for us to have. So I personally, I just want to say thanks to whoever made the comment this evening with respect to tagging things, because that's immediately understandable to those of us who work with social media and such.
All right, would anyone else like to speak to that? Any of the other panelists?
Can I jump in really quick?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just think one other area that comes up a lot in terms of climate, but I'm not sure if somebody brought it up just now, is the policing budget. And I think it's really important to consider not only investments in climate infrastructure or divesting from infrastructure that clearly is not aligned with a climate goal, but to consider what are barriers to climate action in the city. And I think keeping in mind the relationship between police, climate activisms, and Indigenous land and water defense is super important when we're having conversations about applying a climate lens to the entire budget.
Awesome, thank you. And anyone else? Last call for this one. Awesome. So, well, the next question will be, I think, directed more towards specifically Isabel, and this is, does the city use a zero-based budgeting system, or is there a different way that when city staff sit down and look at how they're going to formulate the budget, is there a different way that they use it, or is it a zero-based method?
Yeah, so I think one of my first slides in my presentation talked about the steps that we go through. We identify pressure. So we've been delivering these services for hundreds of years, at least dozens of years. And so we know how to deliver these services, but it's just each year there's new pressures or there's changes in regulation. And that's what we look at, the net new. Look at changes in regulation, legislation, service standard changes, decisions that were made in the previous year through reports, making sure that those are reflected in the base, and any new pressures like inflation and collective agreements. And then we also look for efficiencies too. So it's more adjustments on the base of services that we've been delivering for many, many years. So going back to zero would be really, really difficult.
Thank you so much. And then the next question we'll do is, this is one I think everyone can chime in a little bit because I think there'll be a few different answers, but do we feel like we have, when we talk about affordable housing, do we feel like we have a standard definition we're using? Are we using the standard city definition? And if so, what is it?
There's not a lot of standardization at this point. We talk about a lot of different things when we talk about affordable housing. I think most councillors recognize that we have two crises of housing in the city, one of which is a crisis of people who can afford market housing, but it is taking too much of their income. And this is something that is largely going to be addressed through this is the sort of thing that the CMHC program to create lower rents is intended to address. Is there are people who can afford to get market housing, but it is very expensive right now. So what the CMHC program says is that in order to take advantage of better financing rates for private development projects, the housing that that those contain has to be affordable to 60% of the households in a given area, which I believe in the case of Ottawa, we use Ottawa as a whole. It has to be available to 60% of households taking no more than 30% of their gross household income. So if it's considered affordable if 60% of households in Ottawa can spend no more than 30% of their gross income, household income on it. And that's kind of a market affordability, right? That brings your rent down to, and I'm sorry if I forget the numbers, and please don't quote me, something like a one bedroom that is going for $1,600 is considered affordable under that definition. And we know that, that is significantly less than many, certainly in our 3 wards, where one bedroom apartments in new builds are costing significantly more than that and pushing $2,000 and over a month. So it's a bit of a discount, and there has to be, they have to demonstrate that the overall impact on rent is 10% less than what they would be renting otherwise for. So that's market affordability, and that's that is the concern that the province has been very clear that it wants to address. So in everything around Bill 23, they're clearly trying to address housing for particularly first-time home buyers and try to bring the cost down for them a little bit. Then there's what certainly the councillors on this call, and I think a lot of the councillors around the council table, consider to be a crisis of affordable housing for people who may likely not be able to afford market housing without significant intervention. There is a market failure to address the affordability of housing for many people in our city, and that's what we are intervening with. There is rent geared to income, right? So that, your rent never costs more than 30%, no matter what decile of household income you're in. And that can be accomplished through the rents that are charged by one of the social housing providers, or it can be addressed through rent subsidies. But the notion is that, there is a ceiling to what many people can afford that the market simply isn't going to provide through market mechanisms, and needs to be addressed through things like rent subsidies, rent control, the rent geared to income, and all of those sort of mechanisms as well. So I think when we talk about affordability, we have a very good understanding of what the federal and provincial governments mean by affordability, and then there is a loosier-goosier definition at the deeply affordable level. I stand to be corrected.
Yeah, I just thought I'd chime in to say, yes, in my previous work before running for office I worked for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, where we started to use that language around deeply affordable, which is really rent geared to income, versus what I would call missing middle affordable. I'm just using that term. It's not really how it's used. But we had some really interesting conversations with the Planning Housing Committee today. I've been pushing the city to really start working on a rental housing acquisition strategy. We heard from the Ottawa Community Land Trust about how their proposal, they didn't have a specific budget proposal for 2023, but they will be coming back to us for 2024. They're looking to create a revolving loan fund so that they can essentially buy up moderately priced rental housing, sell it to nonprofits, and then have this floating fund to then snap up the next building when it comes on the market. Because what we're finding, certainly in Centertown, is that these real estate investment companies are buying these buildings, and there's no tenancy control between tenants. So you'll have two people living in apartments in the same building right beside each other, same size building, maybe $1,000 difference in the rent, because there is absolutely no rule saying that landlords can't jack the rent as much as they want, whatever they think the market will bear, between tenants. So this is when you hear that astounding statistic that we're losing 7 affordable homes for every one that we build, it's referring to that specific problem where we see with a lot of rent evictions and down evictions, and when real estate companies come and buy these apartment buildings. So I'm really hoping that's something we can tackle during this term of council, because the Ottawa Community Land Trust proposal is fairly cost neutral once there's an initial investment. They're interested in creating social impact bonds. Again, they have seed money from Ottawa Community Foundation. They will be coming to council. But once you have that fund, you buy the building and then you sell it to a nonprofit and it goes under nonprofit management. And then you buy another one, right? So, I think the deeply affordable housing, the housing for people on Ontario Works and ODSP is crucially important. And that absolutely needs a much deeper level of investments from the feds and the provinces. The city cannot do it alone. But I think there's a lot the city can do to preserve mid-level rental housing that a lot of not just working class, lots of public servants rely on. The average cost of a one-bedroom, certainly downtown, has now gone up to $2,100 a month, which is unimaginable to me. So, yeah, the definition really does matter.
I think the one of the really attractive things about what the land trust is suggesting is that they take the profit motive out of the rent increases, right? You're no longer charging rent according to what the market will bear. You're charging rent according to what you need to recover your costs associated with building maintenance and all those legitimate expenses. Without trying to profit. And the rent increases, the rate at which the rents increase over time is going to be drastically different. And we have two assets at the city that we can, if we make the political choice to do so, there are two things that we can really contribute besides a myriad of process issues. One of which is is cash. Right, helping create that, helping them make those first acquisitions, because once they have assets, you can mortgage those assets. The not-for-profit housing sector are financially very savvy. They will leverage assets that they have, and we see OCH doing that right now with their portfolio of real estate. But we also have land, and there was a campaign commitment by the mayor that he made, and it remains to be seen how it bears out. But leveraging city-owned land is a potentially very valuable way in which to assist the not-for-profit housing sector. And I think a number of us would love to see how we can use the land trust model with city land, putting that into their hands in order to try to accomplish a stronger not-for-profit housing sector.
Yeah, bottom line is we will not achieve anywhere close to our housing goals in terms of both deeply affordable and moderately priced rental housing without taking the profit out of the equation and without basically transferring ownership in whatever way possible, new builds, but also acquisitions to nonprofit housing, because then it holds that rental housing permanently as affordable. And once they pay off their costs and there's no profit motive, and we see this with some of the market rent buildings that CCOC housing owns, for example, then those rents just stay low as they go higher everywhere else. So you're creating a level of permanent affordability across the whole city. So I'm personally really excited about this model. I can't wait to work on it. It's not visible in the 2023 budget, but I think there's some excitement building, and there's some examples from other jurisdictions. So, and even just today, I just met with the folks at Operation Come Home, and they're doing something really interesting. They're doing bulk leasing, where for their youth, they are helping to house through Housing First. They're negotiating like lease agreements for a large number of apartments and then subletting them to their clientele. And they're doing multi-year leases. And that's the way that they are managed to negotiate lower rents to allow that continuity for their clientele. So I just think there's some like really, really interesting models that it's worth exploring. Because certainly what we're doing now, we're not doing enough of it. We're not doing it fast enough.
All right. The next question, I think this is going to be directed a bit more towards Isabel, but people are wondering with the transit budget, what will happen if the provincial or federal governments don't backfill the money that's missing there?
So we've gone through 3 years of the pandemic, and each year the plan B has been similar. It's we'd have to look at continued reductions to discretionary spending. We'd have to look at deferring more capital. We could draw down on some reserves, but we don't have very many. Other reserves, we could borrow from those reserves, but we'd have to pay them back over multiple years, or we'd have to look at service reductions. So and that's kind of in the order in which we would look at things. But we have multiple levers, not desirable. We would much rather get funding from senior levels of government.
Awesome, thank you. I think that's been one of the more popular questions of tonight. Can
I just say one thing?
Go right ahead.
Because some folks in the chat were also asking about the financial impact of Bill 23, which when I asked city staff to estimate how much they estimated that takes out of city coffers, and they estimated it's about 3% of our typical budget. Now, I don't think the real impact of Bill 23 is going to be felt until 2024. The mayor seems confident that the province is going to make the city whole. I am not confident that they will. The city of Toronto, in the process of becoming former mayor John Tory, although he's still technically mayor, has a very close relationship with the Ford government. And I think he was only able to recover like 30 or 40% of costs. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know the exact number, but it was not 100%. It wasn't anywhere close to 100%. So I think this year is going to be hugely determining factor in terms of what level of support we're getting from other levels of government. And then the rubber is going to hit the road in 2024 in terms of where we get revenue from.
All right. And the next question, I think maybe is a bit suited for the councillors and maybe a bit more for Inez include, but if people want to go speak to committees about the budget and express, their concerns and what they want to see, how should they prepare for that? Are there specific questions they should ask or figures they should point out?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we did a training together with Horizon Ottawa a couple of weeks ago now, and it's on YouTube. And if possible, I can share a follow-up link, or I can pop it somewhere that's accessible to people. But it has a template that it lists on how people can just talk to committees and how they can highlight the issue that they want and the way they can ask questions. So we have a delegation template, and then also there's a lot of research, I'm sure, on like Vivek's website. We have a lot of our own research on our own website that they can use just to kind of inform themselves about the role of the city in different areas and how the city sort of like engages and shapes investments in different areas. So that's all available on the Alt Budget website, the Vivek website. I don't know, Inez, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I guess kind of following up from what you were saying, Claude, because yeah, we did do a training a couple weeks ago that is available. But I would say the main suggestions that came from it was having people there to support you if you're giving a delegation. So like friends to talk to afterwards, because it can be a fairly stressful experience. Not feeling like you need to know everything about the city's budget or have documents and a PowerPoint and all of this facts and data. You can just speak to your own experience. That's equally valuable. It's important for that to be heard and to be recorded. And there's also recognition that if you're feeling that the documents aren't accessible, you wanted to include some data and you weren't able to, just bringing that up in your delegation is very powerful and important. And I would say lastly, keeping in mind that you're speaking to the council and maybe other board members, but you're also speaking to the public. So using that opportunity to share with a broader audience can be powerful as well, even if you feel like maybe city council's already made decisions in these spaces, you're still getting a message out there and you're still finding ways to connect with other people, either sharing experiences that they have in common with you or allowing people to hear a new perspective that maybe they hadn't considered.
May I just say it is always legitimate simply to express what your values are. You don't need to be an expert. And I tend to suggest to people that they not try to be experts if they're not. If counselors hear a mistake because you've determined to be clever and delve into the budget and you've asserted a fact that is subjectively wrong, counselors who maybe don't share your values will jump on that, right? If they're hungry and want to make a point. Simply expressing the values, if that's what you want to share, is extremely legitimate. And one of the other stakeholders who are at the table is the media, and the media love to hear the stories. They will often pick up on things that make for good headlines. So describing experiences that you've had, describing experiences that you've heard and know firsthand that others have had as they relate to the budget and the lack of resources that are out there is always legitimate as well. And you don't need to take your 5 minutes. Feel free to share in fewer than 5 minutes if that's what you're comfortable with. I know as counselors, we appreciate that. But do feel free to come to budget and say, the city is not doing enough on housing. Here's how I'm experiencing the inadequate housing in the city in my day-to-day life. So please keep that in mind as you're voting. Please do better on housing is a very legitimate delegation to make to council or to committee.
I'll also say too, please reach out to your counselor's office if you're planning to delegate, because that's really helpful. So we know which community groups are going to be there or which individuals, because then we can deliberately ask you questions to help draw out your values or the point that you're making. But it really is just as Jeff says, although I got like knocked on the nose a little bit today because I was using too many anecdotes when I was supposed to be asking questions. So Jeff was like, Ariel, but no, it really is true. Like storytelling is really powerful and your voice matters. And I feel like a good chunk of what I do as a counselor is collect those stories from the residents who contact our office and then use that to try to influence policy change. So please tell us you're coming and we will help make you feel welcome.
All right, thank you. Now, just because it is 8:30, I will give a heads up. We could go do a few more questions if everybody's okay with that. Does everybody feel okay with that? I think we want to wrap around 8:50, 9 o'clock-ish. But I will give a heads up to everyone that we will be reaching out to everyone who registered, all of the attendees in the coming days. We'll send out the slides from the city's presentation, Vivek's presentation, Coalition for a People's Budget presentation, as well as some resources on how you can get involved with the remaining parts of the budget leading up to the final vote. And if we're good for a few more questions, I think this next one may be long, so it may wrap us up a bit, but this one I'm just going to read in the way that it was written because it's a bit of a long one. Where did it go? Oh no, did I lose it? I did not lose it. But in the news recently, there have been talks about a look at city services and their delivery and the possibility for these services to maybe be contracted out, to look for efficiencies. And a lot of residents are really concerned about this and have been speaking out that they're worried it could mean the privatization of city services. So this, I think, is a question for everybody. If anyone wants to jump in and speak to that, or maybe the counselors or Isabel, if you want to speak to what you know about that process, maybe.
I can speak to it to start. I think the service level review came from a place that was originally going to go to the Auditor General in the city. There was a motion that had been put forward, and it looked like there was council support for that. That was deferred to Audit Committee, which meets on Friday, and I understand that motion will be deferred further to June. And instead, the service level review replaced it. So it's much more, it's less independent than an Auditor General's report would have been, because there'll be counselors, 2 counselors and the mayor on there, as well as city staff, which, well, everyone has a bias about their departments and what they want to see in certain departments. And so the Auditor General is independent and can't be involved in a process that has city staff and councillors debating these service level reviews. I think the way that documents 3 and 4 had come out, those reports that had come out, certainly signaled more of a zeal, I guess, for contracting out and public-private partnerships than was intended, perhaps. And so, really have been working with the city manager's office and the Auditor General recently to try to ameliorate some of those, that wording, to make sure that we're looking at things like bringing contracted out services in-house and the savings that can come from that, or changes to public-private partnerships, like not giving tens of millions of dollars to developers for brownfields, or the community improvement programs, which may not actually be providing incentives to private sector businesses on our traditional main street. So there are a lot of things to look at, and I don't think the document had enough breadth, but I'm hopeful that by March 1st, it comes back to a review that really focuses on high quality services and value for money in that way, rather than sort of this notion of a competitive culture at the city and sort of contracting out. So, because I don't think that was the original intent of the exercise. And so I'm hopeful that document comes back a little bit more nuanced than we saw at first.
All right, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to that or share anything? I think Councillor Menard gave an awesome, fulsome answer there, so thank you for that. Next, we'll look at, again, this one I think is going to be more for the councillors, or Isabel, this is, do we know why there's no longer a council liaison for housing and homelessness? Will this impact the ability to advocate for additional money for affordable housing and related supports?
May I say, I think it is an interesting absence, given what I think every city councillor who went door to door last summer heard around the importance of housing. It's interesting that we don't have somebody who's in that role, and that's on us, that's on council for not stepping up and saying we should have a liaison. Personally, I'm not going to lose sleep over that. Remember that every decision that city council makes is a decision that all of city council makes, expressed through votes. You have multiple strong advocates for housing on council today. We don't need to assign somebody to advocate for housing. I cannot imagine that councillors Troster and Menard will be wallflowers on housing issues through the course of this term of council. I know in my own way I will also be, given the importance, especially that we heard about it through the campaign. So it is a symbolic role that doesn't come with budget. It doesn't come with resources. It doesn't come with powers. There may be a little bit of moral suasion associated with being the housing liaison, but at the end of the day, how many councillors are we now? 25 councillors and a mayor, 24 councillors and a mayor, are the ones who make the decisions. And any councillor is free to make any motions. Every councillor is free to go to the mayor's office, to their colleagues, to the public, in an effort to achieve change. So while we don't have a liaison, it is not something I will lose sleep over. I am very concerned. I was the music councillor, and the mayor would periodically refer to me as the music liaison, which I put on my business card, and we no longer have a music liaison. That one I'm very concerned about. Who will speak for the bands? All right. Sorry.
I'll just say someone who's currently filling liaison role for women, gender equity, and 2S LGBTQ communities that, yeah, just as Jeff said, I mean, in that case, it's kind of interesting because I don't have a specific budget, but I do feel an obligation to speak out and to be involved, you know, and it helps influence the kinds of motions that I bring to council and the sort of intersectional lens that I bring to my role as councillor. But yeah, there's no budget attached to it. So, you know, all I can commit is that I know the 3 councillors that are on this call are incredibly dedicated to affordable housing and fighting homelessness in the city. But I'll tell you that when they did the governance review and they gave us a proposed list of liaison roles, like, you know, I'm so new, I didn't even realize that it was gone until it was gone. So I think we should keep an eye on things in midterm governance review. If we think that liaison role needs to come back, that's a good opportunity to do it.
Ariel, I would just say I'm glad you're in that liaison role because I think there is a tendency on a council that is virtually entirely cishet for the potential for blind spots. Right. Councillors are not necessarily hearing about these issues from their constituents every day, but I have to imagine that on housing, every councillor is hearing a lot about it, and it's much less likely to be a blind spot for council. I think I'm really glad that you're in the role that you're in, so that when we're not bringing that lens to things, you're there to poke us.
Yeah, I agree. And with Councillor Rosalind King doing the anti-racism role, I agree. I think it works really well to bring specific equity issues to the fore. So I hope it continues to work that way.
Like, we don't have a transit liaison either. I'm the scooter liaison, but we don't have, you know, it's not each role that has one. And what we'll see at some point is we are going to set this term of council's priorities. Right now, I guess we are officially without priorities, but we will set up our priorities, and that will become another lens through which we'll need to look.
All right, thank you. And I will say, Councillor Leeper, I do miss there being a music liaison, a band liaison. I miss it. You did such a good job. All right, so I think we'll do 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll probably wrap up. But the first one we'll do is, this year we've seen the implementation of the vacant unit tax, which is a new revenue source for the city that isn't just simply standard property taxes. Now, for the councillors, is there maybe, and this is not set in stone, no one is, this is not super official, but have you been exploring maybe other revenue sources to help boost our budgets, especially as we've seen the crisis with housing and homelessness and addiction in the city and the need for more money, more or less?
I have one. I think we need to look at raising the city fees on ride sharing services like Uber. I think that that issue when ride sharing first came to council in 2016, I don't think council fully understood the impact, first of all, that it would have on the taxi industry, which has been absolutely decimated. And we've seen the near elimination of accessible rides in our city. But I also think that a lot of councillors that might be more conservative, who don't want to see property taxes go up and up and up, will actually be more open in 2023 to looking at alternative revenue sources. And I'm quite swayed by the arguments of taxi drivers that they should be subject to the same fees and regulation as ride sharing services, because right now ride sharing services are paying very little to the city. I think that's an easy source of revenue. Uber's not going to leave town. Other cities have done it really effectively. So I think looking at those kinds of charges are an opportunity to bring revenue into the city. And also, I know a lot of people were annoyed by the vacant unit tax. I know a lot of councillors got complaints. It took me literally 30 seconds to fill out the form, but that's adding $4.4 million to our affordable housing budget this year. So I don't know if other councillors have suggestions.
Sean, did you want to talk about land transfer? There is the potential, and the people's budget identified it, for a land transfer tax like Toronto has. I do not want to underestimate the resistance in the city that would come of that. That's not a discussion even for next year's budget. That is, it's probably a multi-year decision or a multi-year discussion to get the residents of Ottawa to a point where they would be open to it. Sean, you may be more optimistic about it, but that's obviously one that is missing from our toolkit that Toronto is making good use of. We would need to convince the province to give us the power to implement it. Given the current government in Queen's Park, I cannot imagine that they would, but this government in Queen's Park won't last forever.
I'll just add, there's a whole bunch of potential changes that could come that could save us money, and I think yield a better city with higher quality services. You know, first and foremost, if you're looking to solve congestion in certain areas, tweaking parking fees is a great way to do that. We've had transit fares raise quite a lot in the last 10 years, while our parking rates have stayed relatively stagnant over that time. I think there was one increase of 25 cents on average last term, and that was it. But I like, if you look at it holistically, it's a change of strategy for the city around urbanism, right? Stop expanding the urban boundary. It's extremely expensive for us to do that. It harms our environment and more difficult to provide services, and doesn't make a dent in the affordable housing on the affordable housing issue. You know, reducing road widening and new expensive new roads, which will fill up with congestion in the future. That's another way to save money and add to our bottom line. Then otherwise you're just inducing more demand. I think the Strandherd road widening is expected to cost $113 million. That's 6 times more than our record investment in affordable housing. Now, there are different line items and there's DCs involved there, but it's an example of where savings could come from if we truly try to make a difference. Ride shares is a great example as well. Vacant buildings. So we have made some changes around vacant buildings, and that was a big impetus for us with West Coast Video last term. So moving to a model that if there's a building that is vacant, progressively increased costs for those traditional Main Street building owners that are not doing anything with those vacant buildings, that they sit empty and not help our local economies. Brownfield subsidies to developers is one that is being reviewed now. A huge potential pipeline of funds that could come back to the city for something that we're not sure is really yielding a ton of value when we're subsidizing those areas. There's a whole there's a host of things we could do that could yield more funds for the city that would also likely build a better city. So I hope that in the future we start to look more at these things, and we're just starting to now. So
can I just add as well, and the raising the value of our commercial properties is something that is tied in with making sure that we have a very vibrant downtown. If we have a downtown in which more people live and more people shop and more people want to be because it's an excellent place, the commercial properties that are downtown will be worth more and contribute more to the tax base. And that's not insignificant. And Isabel can correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a couple of years since I looked at the numbers. People will frequently ask, why are Toronto's taxes so low? The Fraser Institute puts out this odious report every year that speaks to the different tax rates. Toronto's taxes on a mill rate basis are absolutely lower than they are in Ottawa. And it's partially because the commercial tax base in Toronto contributes, I think, something like 45% of its tax revenues. Whereas in Ottawa, our commercial tax base contributes something like 33%, which means that there's much more burden. I'm sorry to use that word in this context, but a greater share of the required revenues are being paid by residential property owners in Ottawa than they are in Toronto. You could do a lot more with residents' taxes if those were being bolstered to a higher degree by the commercial tax base. And that speaks to creating great places downtown. some of the approach that we've had has been, we see some legacy projects, and sorry, I don't want to go on for half an hour here. We've seen some legacy projects. The creation of the new library will absolutely create a more interesting space around Le Breton. At some point, Le Breton will get redeveloped, and it will begin to contribute some significant funds into our tax base, including from the commercial sector there. But we have not done things like put money into the social services that will ensure that the downtown streets are a more welcoming place for everybody. We built an LRT to bring people to some potentially really great places. Queen Street Fair, and I'm going to put my music counselor hat on again. Queen Street Fair is across the street from an LRT station, and I have to imagine that they're struggling because there are so few people downtown. We have to put money into the small things, not just the mega projects. We have to make those decisions on zoning and public realm and improvements on a day-to-day basis that will pay off long term. The challenge is that those are longer term payoffs with a lot of investment up front. And I think as a council, it's incumbent upon us to be more willing to make some of those upfront investments in making sure that our kids see tax rates that are more similar to Vancouver or Montreal's on the residential side, rather than just perpetuate the current sleepier tax context in Ottawa. I'm sorry, that's not a technical term. Sleepier tax context. That would be a great name for a band, though. Sleepy tax context.
But you know what, Jeff? But just so people know, the city of Toronto is raising their taxes by about 7%. It's include an infrastructure top up this year. The only other thing I'll say is, oh, sorry, Jeff, did you want to continue?
No, I was just how much of that is infrastructure top up?
Only 2%. It's at least 5.5 or 6 that they're going, and then it's about 2% for infrastructure top up. It's very
so a 3.5% increase, 2%, and then another 2%
it's
going into
high.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Every city in Canada is going to have to do that. Okay, sorry.
Absolutely. We're just prolonging the pain. This is what we're going to see in 2024. The only thing that I'll say is from my time working at FCM, Sean also used to work there. Municipalities manage 60% of Canada's infrastructure. We get 9 cents on every dollar. I don't support the strong mayor movement. I do support the charter cities idea, where I know at FCM we were starting to have conversations about having funding. Some sources of funding go directly into big cities from the feds without getting cut in the middleman of the province. Some of Canada's big cities have economies that are bigger than entire provinces. We keep hearing that cities are creatures of the province. I think that there is a movement afoot. I would like to see cities have more taxing power or get a percentage of the income tax. This is dreaming big, but property taxes they're an insufficient source of revenue. They're highly unpopular because when you see an increase, it's on a bill that's in the hundreds or thousands of dollars. Income taxes, people wouldn't even notice if a percentage of income taxes just went directly to cities. So in terms of political advocacy to other levels of government, I actually think that's what the future is, but we're not going to see it anytime soon. But I think you're going to hear more and more about that.
I've delved into some of the budgets in the US where they have free or highly subsidized transit, very affordable transit. And I was like, how do they afford that? And in a number of cases in some of those US jurisdictions, albeit smaller jurisdictions, though they're funding their transit subsidy through a sales tax. And in many cases, it's less than 1%. A 0.3% sales tax in a small to mid-sized jurisdiction is raising a lot of money that's making it possible to have free transit. We don't have that taxing power. We have, basically one taxing power that has been handed to us and by the province, and largely still comes out of an agricultural context. So.
I was going to say, sorry, this is a kind of relevant, kind of not relevant comment, but I did wanted to make a comment to an earlier question, and I just quickly want to sneak it in. I think that there is, like, when we were talking about housing and affordable housing, and particularly some of the crisis that we're seeing in the downtown core and in some of the neighborhoods in and around downtown, I do think that there is an increasing crisis of income disparity, where if affordability standards are being set to 60% of a certain neighborhood or an area, that doesn't necessarily dictate how deep affordability has to be to meet the needs of the other 40%. And if those 40% are actually either being evicted into the streets or just can't afford to pay utility bills or stay in any form of private rental housing market. So I think that one of the approaches that would be really awesome to see in future city budgets would be this poverty reduction approach, which kind of starts looking at things like income disparity and how can we start investments at sort of like the most disadvantaged or the most vulnerable strata of population, and kind of then work our way upwards, rather than having measures or like ways of doing housing that are time and again producing housing for moderate income households, and not necessarily have any capacity to lift low income and really low income people out of core housing need or out of deep housing need. So that's just a comment I wanted to make in regards to an earlier question, but as we're talking about making investments and finding new revenue sources.
Awesome, thank you. So being mindful of the time, it is 8:51, so I think we're going to wrap it up about here. Before I give my lovely thank you, everyone. That was great. Here's the follow-up spiel. I just wanted to give our presenters, the counselors, a chance to let people know where they can find them if they would like to. If anyone wants to jump in and do that, go ahead.
Tessa, on the Q&A questions there, are those going to be followed up with people after? Or are we going to take those down somehow? Or there's so many questions there, and I know we didn't get to a lot of them. But just in terms of process, so folks know what we would be doing with those.
Yeah, of course. So I have some of the key ones down. What we're going to do is either Thursday or Friday, more likely Friday, we'll follow up with everybody. So we'll follow up with all the attendees with the links to the slides that were given from all the different presentations. We'll include the Engage Ottawa link, as well as ways to reach out, because some questions were a bit specific to certain counselors' offices or areas, so they can reach out that way. Additionally, I will say now, if anyone wants to reach out, any of the counselors' offices, be more than happy to answer your questions. And if we can't answer them, staff can't answer them, then we can flip it over to city staff and they can help us out with that.
May I just build on that really quickly? I'm sorry, now I'm starting to wake up now. It's been a long day. One of the things that counselors, at least I have been able to count on for 8 years now, there are often very small parts of the budget where it's, there's nowhere in the book. Every time I've posed a question to city staff, can you help me get the numbers on this? They have made superhuman efforts to get those. I know how many requests for numbers the finance team is getting from counselors. It is remarkable to me that they are getting those answers to us in a timely way. If there is something in the budget where you need a number, by all means, feel free to ask your counselor, because your counselor can probably get that number from the finance team with a reasonable turnaround time, of course, Isabel. Thank you for the work that you've been doing as well.
Thank you. And I want to thank Isabel, because this is second time I've been on a call with you this week giving this presentation, and I know that's multiplied by so many counselors. So thank you. And I want to thank Tessa for moderating, and Inez and Kulud for being with us. These conversations give me tremendous hope. Please do reach out to the office. My website is arieltroster.com. Sean and Jeff are also easy to find. You can go to the City of Ottawa website. Our email addresses are there. Please do reach out. And also please understand that this is a more compressed budget process than we will have for the 3 years after this. And that I really see this as the beginning of the conversation, not the end, because we will be moving into 2024 budget season really soon after this one is over. So hold on to those ideas, even if they haven't made them into the budget. We're going to start this process way earlier next time. All
right, perfect. if there's anyone else who wants to speak their piece before I wrap this up, this is your time. All right, perfect. So as I had mentioned, everyone who registered will be getting an email either on Thursday or Friday with all of the presentations, information about how to get involved for the last half of the budget, and some links both for